Thank you, President van der Leyen. Now we'll hear from the political groups, starting with the EPP. Mr. Mureşan, you have the floor, Siegfried.
Thank you, Mr. President, Minister, President von der Leyen. Thank you very much for coming personally today to the European Parliament to discussing with us the Recovery and Resilience Facility. During the next years, the European Union will spend more money than ever from the traditional budget of the European Union and from Next Generation EU, which we have jointly decided to create. One thing is clear. The more money we spend, the more we need to make sure that money really reaches the people for which it is intended, that we manage to modernize hospitals, to digitize schools, to support people, enterprises and regions affected by the pandemic. The more we spend, the more control we need, the more democratic legitimacy we need, and the more transparency we need. Sometimes for decision makers, transparency requires to make an extra effort, but transparency is the right thing to do. People deserve to know how people's money is being spent. The Commission is rightly assessing now the national plans of the 27 member states, and the European Parliament is scrutinizing this assessment process. What is the European Parliament requesting? What are our expectations? Firstly, we call on the European Commission to strictly apply the letter and the spirit of the regulation through which the Recovery and Resilience Facility was created. An extensive and meticulous assessment of all of the plans. The plans should meet all the criteria of the regulation, and there should be no political concessions. We expect a balance between investments and reforms should also start now. We spoke a lot about investments, about the amounts of the money spent, but reforms are equally important. Reforming means strengthening the European Union, and we count on the European Commission to really be an advocate for reform processes at national level. Likewise, investments have to be future-oriented, as you also described them yourself. They have to help the economy of the European Union to modernize. We, as a Parliament, will adopt this week a resolution about the assessment of the Commission. It will be a proactive resolution on the basis of the regulation. And one thing is certain. The entire response of the European Union to this pandemic will be judged based on the efficiency of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. It is our duty to make this a success from day one and to give people a clear signal that this instrument will help those affected, and it will also make our economies and our societies more resilient towards shocks in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mureşan. Ms. Garcia Perez, on behalf of the S&D Group, has the floor. Thank you, President. The European Union has before it a major opportunity, but also a major risk. The recovery plan that was agreed in July 2020 is a major opportunity. The adoption of own resources by the 27 member states and the issuing of the first 80 billion in bonds by the Commission this year are a gigantic step forward in integration of the Union, 10 years after the Social Democrats suggested the embryo of a European Treasury. States, for the first time, will engage in debt together to achieve an environmental and digital recovery and to help those that were most affected by the pandemic. Now it's up to the Commission to evaluate urgently the 27 plans from the Member States to guarantee that 150 billion in bonds can be issued every year until 2026. And the Council has to approve the first package of aid in July, because there is also a big risk, and that is delay, because delay could flame the ashes of populism if part of the population feels it's being abandoned in the recovery. The future of the youngest Europeans will be decided in how the digital and energy revolutions actually turn out, how they change our productive model. We shouldn't forget that the pandemic has most affected the most vulnerable, destroying jobs, making queues at food banks longer, and particularly affecting women. It's therefore vital that all of the national plans incorporate gender indicators as agreed in Porto, as well as the social targets. You shouldn't doubt that the European Parliament will ensure its voice is heard when it comes to economic governance of the recovery plan to guarantee as much transparency as possible. Social Democrats will not let the Conservatives and Liberals use the recovery to impose austerity once again, which impoverished so many millions over the last decade. Instead of politicising the implementation of the recovery plan, you have to make sure that their partners that are governing in Hungary, in Poland, in Slovenia and Bulgaria actually comply with rule of law and do not divert funds into the hands of their friends. The Commission, the Council and the Parliament have to, in fact, commit themselves to a major leap forward, similar to that created the welfare state after the Second World War. The opportunity is in our hands, and it's one that's desperately needed by European citizens. Thank you. Mr. Garicano, on behalf of Renew, you have the floor.
Grazie mille, Presidente. Ministra, Presidente von der Leyen, Vicepresidente Dombrovskis.
Thank you, President. Madam von der Leyen. Now, when we passed the Recovery Fund about a year ago, we wanted to transform Europe, not just boost the finances of our member states. Now, we really are harnessing this opportunity. Italy, Greece and France have presented ambitious plans. Other countries have also taken this opportunity, but less so, and we see some shortcomings in these plans. I would start with an example from the Spanish plan. First of all, the lack of reforms that my colleague before me mentioned. Spain has very high rates of school dropouts, youth unemployment, and none of this will be corrected without labour and education reform that are deep running. A second shortcoming, we must invest in people, not in things. These plans are spending a great deal of money on things and they're not investing in our citizens. In the Spanish plan, for instance, we're seeing a great deal of money spent on purchasing electric vehicles or renovating housing, and only 300 million on strengthening education. Third, green digital investments should be transformative. They are not subsidies for consumerism of goods. We must invest in the future, not in industry. Because otherwise we will be a continent full of Teslas, but still battling the same problems. Now, Article 26 of the regulation, President, obliges you to take the opinion of this Parliament into account. In the resolution we passed today, we asked for transparency, reform and investment in people. I hope, Madam President, that the Commission will do its work and that we will ensure that this opportunity will not be lost for Europe. Thank you very much.
Luis.
Thank you very much, Luis. On behalf of the Greens, Mr. Bosselager has the floor. Go ahead, Damian, from Berlin, I believe.
Thank you, Presidente. Thank you, Minister. Dear President von der Leyen, the Recovery Fund is no ordinary law. If we get it right, it can be a blueprint for future European fiscal architecture, enabling a more resilient, sustainable and fair economy for all European citizens. My group supported you in setting it up. However, looking at the plans submitted by the member states, we are concerned. Some member states treat the RAF as a simple refinancing tool, which means that its stimulus effect is neutralized and costs are simply shifted to the European level. Many member states avoid ambitious reforms. necessary to modernize the administration, even though the regulation requires them to do so. And most importantly for my group, many member states try the old practice of greenwashing, trying to sell hybrid cars, gas boilers, and other dirty investments as green. Mrs. President, do not give in to these reluctant governments. Do not approve plans that don't fully comply with the law. Tell President Macron that he should address the French CSRs. Tell Chancellor Merkel that she cannot use EU funds to get rid of her hybrid cars. Tell Prime Minister Draghi that he needs to fight greenwashing, and tell all governments across the EU to enforce the do no significant harm principle. You have the full backing of this House to ensure that money is not wasted on national pet projects, but used to fuel a green and a real transition with a lasting impact. You said it. Long live Europe, I would say. Long live a better and reformed Europe. Thank you very much.
Grazie.
Thank you, Damien. On behalf of the ID Group, Mr. Beck has the floor. Gunnar, go ahead.
Thank you very much, President, Commission President. This European Parliament in February agreed to the 750 billion recovery plan, but this is against the law because the treaties actually prohibit going into debt. They aren't entered into any accounting books anywhere, so the EU is breaking the law and is falsifying its books. Germany and the northern European countries will be paying for this. All the money will go to the south, and all the money will actually go to multinationals like Microsoft in the pockets of these people. In Ireland, Microsoft in 2020 made a $360 million profit and didn't pay a single cent in taxes. The EU calls this the moonshot for Europe. And so the EU is looking at, they're scrutinising the national plans. That's the Commission doing that, whereas the Parliament doesn't get the translations in all the languages. Sometimes they're just Google translated, and the IT texts tend to come through in poor English. And the way it is translated in a mechanical way, it is checked in a mechanical way without any transparency. All of this constitutes a farce. Members are looking at texts which are lacking in completion, that have shortcomings, so that German tax money can be sent all over the place for all sorts of pet projects and dream works. Almost all Germans will then have to work until the age of 68 in order to pay for this. Behind Belgium, Germany has the highest tax burden in the world. The Romantic poet Novada said, "You should pay your taxes the way you provide gifts to your loved one." That's something that everybody has to do in the tax colony of Germany. Unrequited love and dedication beyond all else to the EU.
Grazie, onorevole Beck.
Thank you, Mr. Beck. Mr. van Overtveld has the floor in Brussels, I believe. Go ahead, please.
Minister, President von der Leyen, Commissioner Dombrovskis, colleagues. First and foremost, I'd once again like to emphasize how significant this recovery plan actually is. We want to be bolstered and strong coming out of this pandemic. To do that, we have to carry out massive investments in such a way that it'll be a sustainable recovery. But there are four things I'd like to mention. First of all, a lot of the payments here are grants, not loans. The countries don't have to pay back this money themselves, and given that, there may be a lack of active engagement here, and that may harm the effectiveness of these measures. Secondly, the pandemic has brought to a temporary halt our economies, but the structural challenges are the same as before the pandemic. The recovery plan intends reforms to be carried out in an important fashion, and I think that's very important. My third point, the recovery plan is invariably about the billions that are being spent, but what is most important is the quality of that expenditure. And that is an extremely important role that the Commission has there to make sure that this is monitored in the right way.
My final point, the fourth comment that I had, once again emphasising that this recovery plan is an excellent idea. Unfortunately, we've seen examples of the improper use of EU funds in the past. We've seen that far too often. And these excesses undermine the credibility of our common project. And the potential risks linked to this RRF are unprecedented. We're spending a massive amount of money in record time, and so appropriate and enhanced controls and scrutiny are absolutely necessary. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Mr. Papadimoulis. On behalf of the GUI, go ahead please, Dimitris. Thank you, President. The Recovery Fund is a very positive step, President von der Leyen, and that's why all the political groups in the European Parliament, from the left to the right, the constitutional right, with the unfortunate exception of the extreme right, do support it, because what we want is a sustainable recovery of the economy, reducing imbalances between rich and poor, and between countries which are richer and poorer. We don't want to play the game of the austerity vultures, Mr. Garicano, like Mr. Schäuble, who wants to go back to austerity and indebtedness, and the same for Spain, colleagues. And that's why in the European Parliament we're preparing to adopt a resolution with a broad majority which calls for a reduction in inequalities, an increase in transparency, avoiding phenomena of waste and corruption, reinforcing the rule of law to avoid this money going into the pockets of just a few powerful people, but instead to ensure that they go to SME, to health systems, education systems, to the regions, so that all society is involved in this recovery. And so this doesn't just benefit a few rich people. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dimitrios. Mr. Deutsch has the floor. Tamas, in Budapest, I believe. Go ahead.
Tamas,
Thank you very much, dear President. Az Európai Parlament.
The European Parliament, I think, has mistaken the role that it is taking up, it should be playing, because it should be informed, but it now wants to evaluate the national recovery plans of member states. And we could say, oh yes, now again, it's the usual fighting between the institutions. But now the Parliament's attempts slow down the approval of national plans. So practically, political and ideological debate is going on. That's what the Parliament wants to do, make this a subject of ideological debate, instead of leaving it to the Council, who would carry out a professional evaluation. So do not commit this attack against the approval of national plans. And there are, of course, other attacks by certain groups who say certain southern member states are irresponsible, some others attack Central and Eastern European countries, and so on. This is dividing member states and undermining European unity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Weber has the floor. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, President of Parliament, Presidents of the Commission, ladies and gentlemen. The idea of the Recovery and Resilience Facility was to try and enable us to find a way out of this impasse of the pandemic, and also provide for long-term growth for future generations, and also to provide genuine added European value, and that's something that European Parliament has always stood by. Now, in theory, it all sounds well and good, but let's look at the plans that have been put to us already. Then I think you can see very quickly that reality is somewhat different to theory. All the member states have reported investments that they want to carry out, but it's basically just relabeling old investments. Instead of coming up with new innovative investments, it's quite simply old projects that have been rededicated. Cross-border projects with a genuine European added value are ones that you really have to search long and hard to find. In the future, the member states almost all will be saying they need to carry out reform. Now that's a problem, because with money you can hide structural problems, but you can't necessarily solve them. Our interest here was to make sure that there would be reforms linked to this money. And President of the Commission, I do expect that the Commission here will be very stringent before any money is dispersed, that the investments and reforms will go hand in hand to make sure that this continent will come out of this crisis strengthened, that people will be given prospects for employment, and that we can move towards a brighter future together. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gardia Zabal-Rubial has the floor. Ida, go ahead.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President, Vice Minister Dombrovskis, Minister Zacharias. We have 23 recovery plans that have been presented already, and now we're in the crucial stage where the Commission has to assess them, and it then has to submit its proposal so that it can be approved by Council. I think we're all satisfied, broadly speaking, with the agreement and the criteria that we set out in these recovery plans. These negotiations were extremely difficult, and every word of the regulation was laden with meaning. I want to recall here to the Commission that there are a few crucial points for us. First, obviously, we expect the Commission to be absolutely objective in analysing these national plans and applying equal criteria, and that it respects the regulation in spirit and in letter. Our agreement is based on 6 pillars setting out the areas for intervention. Naturally, this includes digital transformation and the green transition as 2 of the most important pillars, but there are also quantitative criteria, and there is a proper methodology set out, the principle of no harm, which needs to be rigorously applied. The regulation also sets out other objectives that we value, and for us, social balance is very important. One of the pillars cuts across all policy areas. Our leaders at the Porto Summit recognised the importance of the European Pillar of Social Rights as a fundamental underlying principle here. When it comes to gender equality principles, then, the Commission seems a little lost there. There's no lack of willingness or capacity, but the Court of Auditors has been very clear. There's a lack of indicators, objectives, delegated acts, and when they exist, they're not used. So please approve the recovery plan to have this in place. This crisis has led to a completely different response from that in 2008. We need to show this clearly and let us not go back to policy making of the past. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. The next speaker is Valerie Haya for 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Madam President, Commissioner, dear colleagues. Europe is arriving with a mass of money in the territories thanks to this common borrowing. This is unprecedented. In 50 years, historians and our grandchildren too will identify this as the start of a genuine European budgetary unity and the start of a more political Europe. But it's essential to ensure the money is well spent, because there's nothing that could be worse than a failure of the recovery. Nothing worse than not being able to keep our promises on climate, on jobs, on growth for future generations. Because the goal isn't to finance airports in the middle of nowhere just to keep construction companies happy before then abandoning them because there aren't enough travellers. No waste We must have a smart recovery which creates jobs and skills. So we, who are elected and are supposed to look at expenditure and to protect the wallets of Europeans, have to demand that states do dedicate 37% of their money for climate. Yes, but we mustn't then fund projects that damage the environment. We need to be consistent. We need to ensure necessary reforms are implemented to bring to an end corruption, fraud and conflicts of interest in states that have to make this effort. We're also asking, and I'll be particularly vigilant on this, that no project, no measure that does not respect our values of pluralism, press freedom, the independence of the justice system, respect of everybody's rights, and in particular of the LGBTI, is financed. It would be completely unacceptable for Europe to spend even €1 on a project that undermines those values. Madam President, Europe is looking to us. Eurosceptics too. What Europe has committed to is audacious, and we will be judged on the results. So let's ensure that this is a total success. And let's ask the question, have we done enough to stand up to the US and China? Taboos have gone out of the window, so let's think now about what else we can do. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Dou agora a...
Thank you very much. Ernest Utasun has the floor now for 1.5 minutes.
Un momento histórico, el hecho.
This is a historic moment. Now, the work on own resources has been ratified, so I think that makes this a historical moment. We will see the first payments in July. Our economies need us to be as agile as possible now. But there are a few things that worry us about the recovery and resilience plans, as my colleague has said. The principle of no significant harm not being respected, for instance. Issues of gender equality that need to be thoroughly analysed in national plans. I know you have a few weeks ahead of you where you need to thoroughly analyse these plans and ensure they are in conformity with the regulation, because this is a significant concern for us. I don't want to get into national political debates, because this will be the worst way of doing that, to air our national grievances here. However, I think the Spanish plan is one of the most ambitious plans when it comes to reform, and it will correspond to the greatest reform ever made historically when it comes to labour, tax reform and so on. Some people are critical because they don't like the type of reform included in the plan. If these reforms are linked to precarisation of the labour market or pensions reform, then that needs to be said clearly. However, we've put the times of the Troika behind us and we need to look to the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, Antonio Maria Rinaldi. 1.5 minutes. Thank you, President. Judging the plans presented so far, few member states have activated the loans section, just up to 66 million. And the logic, I think, is that there are conditions that are disproportionate to the goals. There are limits on use in the RRF, which calls for respect of the recommendations of the country reports of 2019-2020, which precede the crisis of the pandemic, which crystallised the criteria for calculation of the output gap, re-proposing, amongst other things, the Stability and Growth Pact, which has now been suspended in everything that we have that would be pro-cyclical with the effects on employment. The choice of core countries, Germany, France, Spain, Belgium, Netherlands, Austria and others, to not choose the loans part is quite clear, I think, if you look at the NGEU agenda. In fact, if you look at their kinds of investment and the real growth requirements post-pandemic, they do not represent sufficient appeal to be considered useful. So they have turned to alternatives, and many countries have decided for themselves to go to the financial markets with direct issuing of public bonds without the conditionality and without the higher basis point rates. And I would like to conclude by recalling that 365 days have passed since the announcement of the Next Generation programme, but not a single euro has been seen yet, whereas all the rest of the world has allocated rivers of resources, unprecedented amounts. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Próxima.
Thank you. Next speaker, Eudebates. 1 minute.
Dobrý deň, ďakujem pekne za slovo.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the floor.
Máme len nový spoločný dlh.
Only mutualized debt will give rise to questions as to whether there'll be additional taxes that will have to pay it or additional growth that will have to pay for it. The financial crisis have shown us that not all investments are good investments. We've seen poor investments as well that don't improve long-term quality of life. On the contrary, it actually just constitutes speculation, gives rise to bubbles. We've seen in the past bubbles such as the housing bubble, property bubble, and now we're looking at the digital side, but it's not really well thought out. It's not an efficient approach. We have to know that the use of the recovery funds needs to be conditioned by their efficiency as well. There has to be maximum economic growth and it has to be sustainable. Without strong growth, we won't see recovery, we won't see resilience either. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is José Guzmão. 1 minute.
The idea that the European Parliament scrutinises the implementation of the RRP is supported by my group, and we would be prepared to make considerable political concessions as negotiations have shown. The final outcome, however, is too poor. The requirements that the Commission has when it comes to scrutiny are miserable, particularly when compared to the draconian measures imposed by the Commission on certain member states when it comes to structural reform that have had disastrous consequences in the past and that were democratically rejected by the people of those countries. Aside from specific recommendations, the discourse is nearly colonial and reveals an absolute disregard for the sovereignty of the member states that make up this union. It also is telling of some hypocrisy. We've heard the President of the Commission, who is no longer with us now, tell us about the digital transition, the green transition, at the same time as these beautiful words are professed here in the European Parliament plenary chamber. The technical groups of the Commission are demanding that my country's government makes cuts in pensions, healthcare, and that it deregulates the labour market. If the idea is that some of the biggest countries in Europe should be handed over to the far right, well then congratulations, we're on the right path.